So let's bow our heads for a word of prayer as we begin this final session. Our Father in heaven, we do thank you for Elder Steed and for his messages to us this weekend. We pray that once again you would send your Spirit and that you would speak through him. We thank you for these things, and we pray them in your name. Amen. Elder Steed.
There we go. Yeah, thank you for staying by, and I'll try and shift gears so it's not just more of the same, I hope, although I hope I'm consistently bothersome, probably according to my friend Nick Miller, but he and I have talked endlessly on these things. We used to do the TV program together, so we know each other very well. I'm going to do something that my wife hates, but I'm doing it for a reason. It'll focus my mind on this topic. Who reads Liberty magazine? It's a dangerous question. Well, I've probably got enough fingers on that hand. Your church has published Liberty continuously for 106 years or so. No, 112 years. 112 years. And you probably don't know that while we've had troubles lately with the closure of the Review and Herald and moving to another publishing house, and last year they actually lost 40,000 names, believe it or not. But we still print nearly 170,000 copies every issue, and that's quite high. Signs is toying with 50,000, Message magazine about 20, and on and on. Sabbath School Quarterly is quite a lot, thankfully. But I know the Review and Herald, it's regular subscription base. Again, they're below 20,000. So Liberty's doing very well. But for decades, we've been drumming into our members that we need to send it to these thought leaders, because America's at a crossroads. It needs to be reminded of a separation of church and state, constitutional, historic concept. It needs to be warned against the drift toward ecumenical compromise and so on. So there's a good reason to send it to these people, and we are. But a byproduct that I don't think anyone much thought about, or even to this late day, perhaps I'm the only one that is bothered about it, but it creates the result that we just saw. You're no different from any other church. Of the 165, before the move we were 185,000. So it's the best part of 200,000. We can only identify about 10 to 14,000 of those going to Adventists. And how many are we in North America? 1 million members plus. I think 1,100,000 now. So by definition, we're not covering our own constituency. So I'd like to encourage you to read it. You don't even have to buy it. Go to Liberty Magazine, you can remember that, .org. It's all there, and I'm there at the moment, and I want to read something that I wrote. No copyright problems if I read my own stuff. And it was an editorial of a few issues ago called The State of the Union. And I'll tell you freely, I did it because I just listened to the last State of the Union. And this is what I wrote. Every now and then I feel bad about writing these editorials for a very simple reason. I'm often the bearer of bad tidings. Of course, the undertow of almost every discussion is that in the United States and a good majority of developed countries, the right to religious freedom is not questioned. Most of the legal challenges in those countries can seem like quibbles, and sporadic social questioning is not usually an in-your-face challenge. So why not bubble on about how good things are? I often laugh at the archetypal politician's answer to a difficult question. Don't answer the question asked, answer the question you wish had been asked. I'm sure you've watched enough TV shows to know that's their classic style. The result can be rather unnerving in denial of reality. Maybe an editorial needs to be a little more formal, sort of like a periodic State of the Union message from the magazine. If I adopted the political style for such a thing, I might take credit for anything positive, blame others for my mistakes, and make assertions that float free of logic. You'll be happy to know I think that improper for any discussion of religious liberty. But let's start off the way an ideal State of the Union message might. In the United States and most Western democracies, religious freedom is still cherished as a necessary part of a free society. Wave flag here. Cheers and whoops of joy. Our laws uphold it as a basic freedom. Stand up for the people's approbation, judges. Unlike those countries that hold 70 or more % of the world's population, we are committed to facilitating the free practice of religion for people of all faiths or none. Good time to quote a quaint Popeye musical that had the people of Sweet Haven singing, "God must love us," oblivious to the decay of their surroundings. More to hand, George W. Bush once enthusiastically proclaimed that, quote, "God has blessed America, and he couldn't have blessed more deserving people." You know, he actually said that. Standing ovation here. Camera turns to a gaggle of television prosperity preachers and their shining children. Enough said. Let's go back to another year or so of the real world, happy that our religious freedom is safe, or at least seen to be safe. Last year, we remembered 500 years since the Protestant Reformation, the period when the concept we now see as self-evident first emerged as a dynamic reality. Before that, it was believe as the church says, or believe what the tribe says, or sometimes attack the other tribe and their weak God to show that our cult is stronger. But I noticed that in remembering the Reformation, we forgot to mention what it was about. In all the lectures and celebrations of Luther, I never heard so much as a listing of his 95 theses or discussion points. So I'm forced to deduce that the lessons of that era have moved into legend, and the principle itself has been fogged by time. Similarly, with the US Constitution, who reads it anymore? Is it enough to speak glowingly of how great it is and not be able to explain its details? Oh, I misspoke. The Second Amendment is pretty well known. The First makes me wonder. Freedom of the press is enshrined there, and we are all in a dither of uncertainty about fake news. Goebbels would be amused. And the religion clauses, I do not think too many muse on what they actually say. Congress, this is it, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prevent the free exercise thereof. Seems clear enough. James Madison, there's a tour tomorrow down to his home. James Madison in particular wrote extensively on how this banned the government from paying for religious instruction and other subsidized religious activity. What would he and his peers make of the food fights that we now witness in the church scramble for public money? Scratch most of the current religious liberty cases or challenges a little bit, and you'll find that they're really about money. It might appear that some aspect of religious practice or sensibility is threatened, but in actuality it is just that the threat of losing states in actuality, it's just that there is the threat of losing state subsidy for religious activity. Put another way, what we are witnessing in the US today is a flowering of religious entitlement in the name of religious liberty. The real story of today's religious news is that there is an unprecedented political alliance between the government and a very politically active subgroup of the religious community that has a very specific agenda. Exactly the sort of thing the First Amendment was designed to prevent. It might be just a salutary structural mistake, but for the fact of the current state of society and its democratic institutions. One does not have to be a partisan hack to note that dysfunction rules the day. While the waters before the last election were bloody and roiled at evidence of heavy-handed police actions, there was not generally a public breakdown of law and order. That may yet come with encouragement of certain grievances. The fourth estate, as the press or media is known, has never been more vilified and ineffectual. A startling development for a free society. The judiciary, long the object of ire by such as anti-abortion activists, has been further diminished as so-called judges. Do we really want our judiciary to become auxiliaries after the order of Russia, Pakistan, and Iran? The party system, itself feared by many of the founders, has been emasculated by a series of events surrounding the most recent election. The intelligence services, a hitherto trusted element of government, though arguably themselves a byproduct of modern paranoia, have perhaps been irreparably diminished by recent events. Our executive, emboldened by the extra powers assumed by recent administrations, acts in ways that to many outsiders evokes totalitarian overreach. And follow the money again, we have the elephant in the room certainty of currency debasement, which will unleash barely imaginable threats to public order and freedoms, all of which make the rapidly increasing idealization of our military power a significant development. Freedom cannot long survive in a society in love with war, and most particularly, such an emphasis is antithetical to religious freedom, but not to religious violence. And at the end I say, allow me to lower my voice a little from its Cassandra-like tone to a more measured State of the Union call to action. Figuratively, our freedoms may be under Pearl Harbor-like attack. To borrow a little World War II British analogy, we may even be mid-channel in our Dunkirk pullback. We may even be in the twilight of empire, and empires expire both with a puff of wind or a blaze of militarism. Only time will play out these existential portents, but the most important thing, individual civil and religious freedom, for example, lie in our power to protect now. They are the issues of ultimate homeland security. Protecting them is to protect true greatness. I don't know what you think of that, but that's my State of the Union. And I had a contact from a fellow that I'd met before. I'm looking for something while I'm talking, but I had a contact recently from a fellow at one of our churches near Andrews University. He's a good religious liberty leader, but I think he sees things differently from me. And he says, I've been reading your editorials. I don't know if it was that one. And he says, they're very hard to get at. He says, you're not speaking clearly. And he says, I've deduced that you're criticizing some of the things that are going on in our government. So he says, what do you really think? So I said, well, you're very perceptive. I said, I do speak obliquely. and in a level, I think it's smart. While it was said that A.T. Jones and he actually wasn't his co-editor. A.T. Jones was the editor, and Uriah Smith was his associate editor. Jones was pretty full-throated on occasion, but that's the one thing Ellen White consistently criticized him for. She says, we don't need to lash out at people like this. She says, you'll make enemies if you two in their face. I mean, I'm making it more colloquial, but she told him not to be, like, I'll tell you one example, and it involves Uriah Smith. At the beginning of the 1888 General Conference session, where Jones and Wagner, who was his co-editor or his associate editor on the Liberty Sentinel, the precursor to Liberty, Jones was the main speaker. But they had a meeting ahead of time where the church leaders discussed which Germanic tribes or nations made up the 10 toes of Daniel 2. You have no idea the energies that your church has expended on prophetic minutiae. Anyhow, they were debating it hot and heavy, and after Uriah Smith finished, Jones got up and he says, Brother Smith may have no idea who the toes are. He says, but I do. And she says, easy, Brother Jones, easy, Brother Jones. So that was his weakness. But I think we've, You alienate. Liberty goes out to all sorts of political types. I don't want them to instantly recoil. I want them to read it at least. Maybe he's got a point. So I said to this guy, I said, yeah, you're right. I'm trying to speak obliquely, very perceptive. And I said, I'll answer you in the same vein about what I think of what's going on now. In the same words that I used in just a little introduction I was allowed to give at our Liberty dinner. Liberty magazine began it, but it now encompasses NALA, which is our membership program that we're establishing for members to get involved with religious liberty, the North American Division Religious Liberty Department, the General Conference Religious Liberty Department, and the IRLA, the International Religious Liberty Cover Organization that we deal with others. So I had 2.5 minutes, and I welcomed them, but my central point was I said, in America today, we're seeing a lot of dependence upon Milvian Bridge and Claremont solutions. Does it mean anything to you? I was hoping that somebody in the Liberty Dinner audience will, what's he mean? Constantine came to power in a civil war, and the last battle that brought him to emperorship was at the Milvian Bridge, where he saw an image of the cross in the sky. He says, no one else saw it. And, with this sign you will conquer. And he became the patron emperor for Christianity, and persecutions began almost immediately. I have few regrets on liberty, but I regret that I let one of our Adventist authors write an article on persecution. I signed it to him, but he wrote on Constantine, and he extolled him as a wonderful, beneficent guy, and he said he never persecuted. The persecution started later. And I quibbled with him and printed it anyhow, because he says, oh no, he didn't persecute. And afterwards I got some letters from people, and it clicked with me. Of course he persecuted. The very first thing that Constantine did when he decided to be the godfather of the newly accepted Christian church was he brought all the church leaders together, put all of their books on a table in front of him, had them dispute it, and he says, I don't care much. He said this, but he did care. I don't care what you settle on, but I want uniformity of religion in this empire. And the main argument was about the Trinity. And once they settled that, they took all the books that disagreed with it, threw them away, and then persecuted Arius and all of those that had a Unitarian view of God. And for what it's worth, just as a little teaser, go and read what Ellen and James White and the Pioneers said on this topic. They've been characterized by some of the more adventurous Adventist theologians as holding a view on the Trinity that would not be acceptable today. That may or may not be true, but that's an incredible deduction for people to make about our Adventist pioneers. But he persecuted, there's no question. So it was at the Milvian Bridge the church-state union began, and I don't know what anybody saw during the 2000 election, but it's functioned the same way. And the Claremont, that's when Pope Urban, the first I think it was, but Pope Urban stood up in Claremont, France, at a time when the Saracens were troubling the pilgrims in Jerusalem. And he says, Christians must take up arms and go over there and by force of arms relieve them. He says, God wills it. It was the beginning of the Crusades. I think we're in the middle of that. I want to read you something. It's not from a religious magazine at all, but it's food for thought. It's a few years ago. August 2001. That's an interesting month. It's like before all the troubles, isn't it? 1 month before September 11. There's an article in Harper's Magazine, which over the years has printed some literary greats of the US, very erudite magazine. And the author, or the editor, wrote about the American Rome on the theory of virtuous empire. And I think he was a cynic. I tried to get him to write for Liberty once, and he actually agreed. And then I had him on the phone, and I hear him talking to his assistant, and he backpedaled subtly and said he wouldn't. I think he figured out that this is a Seventh Adventist Christian magazine. But he was a very good wordsmith. And this is what he said about American exceptionalism. He says, if every now and then An American commits a monstrous crime, Lee Harvey Oswald, Lieutenant William Kelly, Timothy McVeigh. The action is declared un-American, senseless, unthinkable, so contrary to the laws of nature and the will of God that it can be intelligently discussed only by senior churchmen and high-priced psychiatrists. Never intrinsic to the American landscape or the American character. Evil is a deadly and unlicensed input, an outlandish disease smuggled through customs in a shipment of German philosophy or Asian rice. Innocent by definition, America invariably finds itself betrayed. At Pearl Harbor, the Little Bighorn, Havana Bay. And because we have been betrayed, we can also justify the use of brutal or unchristian means to defend the ark of safety against the world's treachery. Which is why America never needs to appoint truth commissions similar to those established by South Africa, Chile, Burundi, or any other country seeking to come to terms with its inevitably tragic past. The American past isn't tragic. We are the children of revolution, not history. And together with the twice-born President Bush, this was back then, we can assume that because we possess a natural instinct for the good, we need not concern ourselves with law. Laws are for people unlucky enough to have been born without the DNA of virtue. Think about it. He's mocking the whole concept, but I wouldn't mock it. This is a wonderful country that has as strong a streak of morality and goodness and charity as any. That's not the question. But this idea of American exceptionalism, which we're into full-blown at the moment, comes from what I was telling last lecture. It's by way of the Puritans and the Protestants, the Protestant Puritans of post-Civil War England, that they were God's agents. They were establishing the kingdom of God on earth. This is the land of promise, and Ellen White toys with it. I don't think she abuses it, but it's the subtext of what she writes about this country. Just because this has been a refuge for people fleeing persecution from many countries, just because it's got a good constitution and has high ideals, doesn't by definition mean that everything it does is above criticism. And in fact, you and I should know, it's written in great controversy, but I believe when it comes, we'll be loath to accept that even in this land of freedom, it has in the past sporadically and will in the future consistently trample on conscience and goodness and virtue. And I believe we had a little taste of it post 9/11. We didn't ask for the towers come down, if you accept the superficial tale, which may not be true. I think it's like the Kennedy assassination. We'll never quite know. But let's just say it was radical Islam. We didn't ask for that. But in the response to it, it was shocking to me and a few other observers how quickly we stripped away all of our basic freedoms for certain classes of people in certain situations. Even on the level of acts of states, we're signatories to the Geneva Conventions that directly prohibit things like waterboarding and all this nonsensical talk about is it really torture or not. That's almost irrelevant on international law. It's specified that it's not allowed. We got out of it by legal gymnastics, denying that these people were even combatants. They were not. We went back to the medieval era. The combatants are only defined as nation-state actors. These are freelancers. They're just criminals. So therefore, Geneva Conventions don't apply. We're in another little state like that at the moment with illegal immigrants. I haven't seen the footage of it yet, but it bothers me just to hear the news that we shot across the border and killed someone on the other side of our Gaza Strip who was wanting to come. That's shades of what I grew up in the Berlin Wall and all this. We used to tut-tut and say, this is godless communism, killing people that want freedom. But we're doing it now. Some people are objecting, but I believe we're in a transitional moment and we're inoculated from it by this sense of exceptionalism. The United States has been an exceptional country. Alexis de Tocqueville made that plain as he analyzed it. But it doesn't mean we're exempted from the laws of God and man, or the laws of prophecy, if you like. And you and I, as Adventists, hopefully as readers of Great Controversy, and hopefully a little bit conversant with history, I think we should have the clarity to see things for what they are. I don't often say it anymore, but years and years ago when I used to give lectures, I would often give the example of the Jews in Hitler's Germany. It seems incomprehensible looking back at this distance from the horrors of World War II, but in the decades before that war, there were many articles written, you can go and look them up online, about how Germany was the most amenable place in Europe for Jews to live. It wasn't just a reasonable place, it was the best place. And then with the rise of, it wasn't just the Nazis coming to power, it was the cataclysmic situation between the wars that, and I have a reason for saying what every time I say it, people sort of laugh it off, like I say that this whole homosexual thing will fade away. Because we've seen an experiment in Germany. What World War I did, and I'm jumping to a separate track, but I want to tell you this. What World War I did to Germany and to much of Europe, not to America and Australia on the periphery, but Europe, it destroyed their sense of ease about the world as they knew it. It was a great depressant. And what happens when people are depressed, when everything they have to depend on is gone? They're aimless, they're listless, or they're morally listless. They just do anything. There are no constraints anymore. That was the era of the flapper in the song and gaiety and the speakeasies and all the rest. And in Germany, all constraints were off. Berlin nightlife, there was transvestites, homosexuals, the whole thing run amok. And if you're inclined to go see it, even now in the US, there's Cabaret, a quote, nice musical, still pops up now and then. That's a dramatization of that period. It was grotesque in its sexual dissipation. That was what characterized Germany, because it was a lost generation. Meanwhile, out in the hinterland of Germany, the Lutheran middle class looked on it, affronted, aggravated, just like the right-wing religionists in this country, aggravated. So when the brown shirts started to react to this, their first call was, we will morally reform this country. And they started rounding up transvestites, gays, mental defectives, physical defectives, cripples, Jews, gypsies. But Jews were about the last to go. And people loved it. And I believe we will come at that same thing here. And I still believe that in the last election, the toilet thing, bathroom deal, you can go to anyone at any time you feel like, that was just a bridge too far. And it's going to go so far. And what the Pope's pushing for now, a return to biblical morality, honoring the Sabbath day, and all, you think that's going to coexist, no matter what they do behind Vatican closed walls? You think that's going to coexist with downtown San Francisco? Not. How they'll deal with it, I don't know. But I myself, I think it'll be a version of don't ask, don't tell. Because they're not going to morally regenerate the human mind, but the pattern of behavior superficially will change. And so the point that I started to make, Germany was the best place to live, and then things started to change. The whole mood with the rise of the brown shirts, the Nazis, eventually the Nazis. What would you have done if you were in Germany when that started to happen? Or I'll be more direct. Since 9/11, you've seen liberties go. They're not knocking on your door, but I'll tell you, for certain people, the Constitution doesn't protect them anymore. Take time to read the Patriot Act. It's very oppressive in many ways. It gives an open go. And in fact, a law professor once, I heard him interviewed, and they asked him actually a question with its own answer. He says, is it true that the only thing standing between me and indefinite imprisonment is the good graces of the president? And the law professor said, he was from George Washington University, he says, yes. He says, the only thing standing between me and indefinite imprisonment is the good graces of the president. You can find that in the military what's the bill? Anyhow, the military appropriation bill of that year. It says that the war on terror can be fought against the citizenry. And he says, we have actually been taken back to a point in history before the Magna Carta. Now, the only reason you don't think, that it doesn't bother you is no one's after you. But you've got to remember the law works on precedent. And the precedent has been set. And if it's not challenged, at some future time, it'll be applied elsewhere without challenge. That's the very sad part of what we're in. And, on one level, I wouldn't try to make a case that we're living in a desperate, overbearing situation. It appears okay. And if you read the history of the collapse of Rome, it was like that for most people. There was a semblance of order right up till the Visigoths were on the gates and sacking Rome. And the collapses of systems happen very quick. As I said in my editorial, we're headed for currency debasement. It's certain. I mean, the question was asked there, and Nick, I was thinking at the same time as my answer, whose picture is on this? But in reality, that's all you have as a picture. It's a piece of paper. It's just meaningless, except there's a structure erected by this government, and we all take part in the charade. And as in Germany, with their hyperinflation, at a moment's go, you'll suddenly find your money's almost worthless. That's what Ellen White says. She's a prophet. She says the day will come when people that have failed to give their money to the church will throw it at the church and it will be worthless. I remember once at one of our religious liberty conferences at lunch, I was talking to some people about this, and at the next table, a guy leans over, because I'd mentioned his country, and he says, I'm from Zimbabwe. And he says, it's as bad as you said. He said, we had millions of percent inflation. Millions! He says, we would get our pay and run as fast as we could down to spend it, because it was devaluing. He says, with a $10 US bill, you could break a bank. They only solved their problems, which is an interesting phenomenon of some third world countries. They adopted the US dollar as currency. There's been several experiments like that. One was in Eastern Europe, where they had massive runaway inflation, and they introduced the US dollar, which of course is internationally traded. We know what it's worth, and people got used to that, functioned okay, and then they transferred it back to the original currency, and it continued fine, because money works if everybody buys into the construct. But if people suspect it or realize that it's nothing more than a sort of an airy promise, it goes. We're in that situation. And I believe that's religious liberty as a subtext that's happening, but I think the dynamic that's driving it is when the plug is pulled on the economy. And I quoted it once, probably precipitously, in 2008, in one of the last articles that I could be bothered writing for the review. And I quoted from Revelation. And I quoted there, it says, the merchants are wailing because in 1 hour all of their wealth goes. Remember in 2008? That was a pretty major collapse. It was worse than you probably knew at the time. 60% of the world's merchant fleets were at anchor at one point. 60% of all of the boats in the world sitting at anchor. I remember seeing one video of boats anchored off Singapore. Boats to the horizon. The system was broken, and it hasn't been fixed. Hasn't been fixed. And I'm not a financial expert, but I read a lot. I took macroeconomics and cost accounting and all the other stuff not all, but those sort of things in college. I have a bit of an idea. To me, we're on borrowed time, because in the last 2-3 years, the Federal Reserve, which is a construct anyway, a private coalition of banks, not even really the government, they came up with a brainwave idea to bail the banks out of the 2008 collapse, because they never restructured them properly at all. In fact, Trump has opened the gates, but what they've done, they recapitalized them with magic. And they used a term, language is being used nowadays to disguise stuff from everyone. They call it quantitative easing. Anyone heard of that? I listened on public radio once. They interviewed one of the Fed governors, and they said, "Can you explain it?" And he says, "Well, not easily." He says, "I do it," but he says, "It's sort of magical." He says, "I sit at the keyboard and key in a number, and magically money appears on the bank's bottom line." They gave them, by my figuring, about somewhat over $2 trillion. But it isn't money, it was just numbers. Most of the US debt, a traditional way that the US or any government wants to raise money to finance a debt, is they issue a bond. Somebody, whether it's China or whatever, buys their promissory note, gives them money. They might give them $1 million, and the US government agrees in 10 years to pay them back, 1.1 million. That's how they raise money. But this didn't go through those niceties. Just type in a number, a couple of $1 trillion. And I'm telling you, that's like dropping gelignite in a financial system. So, it's not religious liberty or prophecy directly, but it should be, at the very least for us that know prophecy, it should be sort of like the armies pulling back from Jerusalem just before the final assault. There's something big about to happen. But we've lost a lot of liberties in the US, but it's still, ironically, and I think I mentioned it before, like The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, a story of the French Revolution. He starts it by saying, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I've got to tell you, on our religious liberty front, we have access to politicians like we've never had before. We can talk to them very easily. We can hold a dinner, and they come. Not all of them, but a representative group. We've had Hillary Clinton and John McCain, and I can go on and on. We've had top people. They come. They talk to us. In A.T. Jones this time, you can read his testimony, and he makes a lot of it, but he really wasn't on first name terms with any of these. I did it now. With any of these people. It's gone, right? But we have opportunities. The precedents are shifting beneath our feet, but you and I yet are not restricted. There are people that would love to restrict you. I mentioned the Pope. He hasn't mentioned Adventists, but he says extremists and fundamentalists. You better believe we're under that. As we came up to the year 2000 with the mythical, turned out, year 2000 bug, the FBI went into overdrive, and I read in their stuff, they gave a profile of who were the troublemakers, and that said anybody that believes in the literal and imminent return of Jesus Christ. I don't think they meant Adventists, but we meet the description of a suspect group. So it's like the Jews in Germany. The clouds are darkening, the tentacles are going. They didn't run for their life. What did they do when they were asked to put the Star of David on? Must have scared them. Put it on, a lot of them. Very few headed off. And admittedly, the US and other Western countries were complicit in bottling them up. They wouldn't accept them. They wanted Hitler to have to deal with this alone. But they didn't go. Then they started trashing the shops. So eventually they couldn't buy or sell. So they started trading among themselves. They were clustered together in ghettos. And I don't know if you know what happened in World War II. The Jews themselves had to put together the shipments out of the ghettos for the death camps. They chose their own people. They did that thinking they wouldn't be on that train. Then when they were nearly all there at the camp, some of them decided they'd rather be a guard, might give them some special privilege. So I don't really know whether to directly correlate that to us, but there must be an element of it. We're like the frog in the slowly warming water. At what point are the warning signs so great we either, as Ellen White used to say, go to the country, this sort of country? I can tell you, having seen the empty spaces in Australia or Idaho even, this is not really country. But at what point do you sort of get out of town or buckle for the thing, or as many of us are doing, think it's never been so good. We don't feel like we're pillars of salt just yet. We can hang about a bit. I remember in one meeting, a fellow sat in the front, and a middle-aged guy, well, he's probably older than middle age. He might even have been my age. And he said, tell us, he says, when we shall be afraid. Tell us when we should be afraid. I don't want him to be afraid to start with, but, why should you want someone to sort of give you the signal? I remember that when I was a kid growing up in Adventism. I remember once I had a dream when I was a teenager, and in my dream I saw, it was like a diorama painted on the sky, and here someone was cranking the sky open, and then the angels appeared and playing their trumpets, and I remember thinking, look happy, look happy. If you're happy, you'll get by with this. But I think an awful lot of Adventists, because I know it's our tendency, think that we'll do whatever we're doing, we're good Adventists, but we won't get serious till some sort of signal that this is now it's time to really get ready for the final stretch, and then we'll sort it all out. I'm sure the Jews thought the same thing. 6 million of them probably thought the same thing, and it didn't work for them. And my burden now, and I'm invoking A.T. Jones, that's what occurred to him. He was wrong, as everybody. Back to the days of the apostles and Jesus himself. Remember, Jesus looked them in the eye and he says, yeah, you won't die. Some of you won't die before you see me in your glory. We've passed that out as though it was the Mount of Transfiguration. I think as C.S. Lewis, who I have very little respect for, but C.S. Lewis once logically said, it's better to believe in a God who didn't know than a God who was wrong. Jesus didn't know. He said it elsewhere where he says, only the Father in heaven knows that day and that hour. He was believing it could happen. A.T. Jones, in his day, saw a national Sunday law, which reminds me, I meant to print it out, but I don't have it. A national Sunday law put forward by Senator Blair. This was what they were expecting, what Ellen White in prophecy had been told was to come. This was it. So what was missing? He looked around at only 15,000 Adventists in 1888. People forget, it sounds great, and you read the books. It's just a little flock, as Ellen White called them, just a couple of church loads of Adventists. And he says they're not ready. They need a revival. So that's why in 1888 he stood up at the General Conference and argued for righteousness by faith and a preparation of godliness for this time of trouble. And in the past, I've read some of his stuff. It's fabulous because he says, when they take your job and your life, even your livelihood and everything you have, he says, who can stand with that? He says, most people, just like Latimer, Ridley, and those others, Cranmer, who went to the pyre and died, when the thumb screws were on, they recanted. We're weak, right? And A.T. Jones says, you'll give it up. But he says, if you've died to this world, if you're alive in Christ, if you're hid with him, if that's the center of everything, no one can harm you. You're already beyond them. And that's if there's any secret of the A.T. Jones message, that's it. It's this otherworldly description of what the new birth and a Christ hidden life is, and it seems to have escaped most people. And he believed that we needed that revival to deal with it. And I've been very sympathetic that since our second term GC president came, he called for revival. It's what we need as we look probably not to a distant future for something analogous to that early warning Sunday law. It could be the family rest day that the Pope's pushing. That's what's hidden in all of these documents. They want an international day when everyone ceases from their labor, the family gets together and goes to church. But Ted Wilson's call, kings and prelates and that, they can't snap their fingers and create revival, but it was a good call, best that could come from administration. But as I've travelled around, it seems to me that the revival is gone, and if I have to analyse it, I'd say it died on the altar of women's ordination, at least the argument about it. You can't have a revival in the middle of a dispute. It just can't happen. Whether the dispute has any merits, that's quite another thing. But that's my burden on religious liberty. I think an easy case can be made for civil and, by definition, religious liberty a great threat, not in a classic way, because it's an entitlement going on here. Religion, the Supreme Court, did what we knew they would do. upholding religious prerogatives. But hidden within that is basically a narrow view of religious prerogatives, a prejudicial attitude to other human beings, no respect for Islam, and goodness knows they've asked for it. I mean, in a certain civil sense, but still, religious liberty will not stand unless everybody is protected to believe or disbelieve as they're drawn by conscience. Once we start to balkanize it, trouble is ahead. And we're headed for trouble. And my burden has been that Adventists wake up and get serious about this. Or if not, give it up forever. To me, it's a moment of truth. I read Ellen White like you do. I know a bit of history, and I know that even if the church, in its largest sense, gives a pass to it, some group of people will stand up. It's always the way it is. But it's sort of sad that it might devolve down to just a handful of so-called fanatics who put their lives on the line for something that our whole movement and our whole family of 1 million plus Adventists in North America we say we're ready for, or we're expecting, not ready for it, we're expecting it. I wish liberty was read more, but that by no means is the key to it all. It's just one of the little signs. I wish we were more informed. Somebody earlier today made a comment that Adventists are not really reading the news much. No, I guess they were speaking for themselves, but I think in the main, Adventists are not highly informed on what's happening. It's not just because there's a lot of right-wingers who might only watch Fox. I feel very culpable on Fox. That's owned by an ex-Australian, Murdoch. He honed his craft in Australia with girly magazines and all sorts of craziness. But, they're pandering to a certain narrow view that people are comfortable with. But, you can watch Fox, and another one too. If you're a discriminating person that has Bible education and knows a bit of prophecy, you're not going to be misled just by one dose of Fox. But we should expose ourselves a little bit more. And, as an editor, I've been on a guilt trip a number of times in the past because Ellen White has some rather startling things to say that you probably have forgotten about reading newspapers. That we shouldn't read a litany of horror and all the rest. Well, I think that's true. But I think in a dynamic age where information is so important and deceptions are on every hand, we owe it to ourselves and our security to be informed. Ignorance exposes you to many things. And we're only saved, back to the Reformation, on the basics of our relationship with Christ. I'm sure of that. But we can be lost by not knowing a lot of extra things. If we're uninformed or naive on certain aspects of prophecy or how religion is applied in the real world, we can be led down a horrible garden path where we find that we're part of the great mass that follows the deception and not even realize it. And the only thing I can't quantify or put in, we have to believe that God moves on hearts and minds in ways we don't understand. But as far as the dynamic of human behavior, I know that's so. You could be led into a deception if you don't know. I've been through a lot of thinking over the years on this. I remember being shocked as a relatively, a very young person, barely 20, going to India for the first time. So, sort of shocking to my sensibility to see a gazillion people stretched out over the plain. And the first time I saw them, they were all going to the toilet in the morning. As far as you could see, a mass of people squatting there. It's hard to hold on to your view of the value of the human soul. China, or the Asian area, the same. But, somehow we need to realize that we're important. God's got a place for us. We're not just ciphers in the mass of history, that we can help make a difference. Adventism was founded on that idea. I've got to tell you freely, and I'll debate with Nick later. We've got to be careful as Adventists we don't buy hook, line and sinker into the social gospel. A lot of other Christian groups have founded on that. Ellen White warns against it, not because it's wrong, but it's not present truth. We're not to make the world heaven here and now. We're to bind up the wounds and to care for the widows among us first and things like that. But we're taking people somewhere else. We're looking to a new earth, new heaven and a new earth. But of course we can do something, and we should speak out to social issues. I know a lot about the temperance thing, and there's a little bit of an exception there. Ellen White was very, very aggressive on the what amounted to the prohibition movement. But she herself gave the reason why it wasn't just a social message, wasn't just a moral cause and to make society safe or more observant of Christian norms. She made a comment that I don't think many Adventists are quite aware of. She said, the only way that heaven has of contacting us is through the nerve endings. The only way. Makes sense when you think about it. If you see something, it's an optic nerve that translates it in your brain. If you're receiving some sort of mental communication, electric, comes in your brain. I mean, the scientists now can sort of beam stuff or put an electrode and give you certain thoughts and so on. That's the only way of spiritual impression. So with alcohol and drugs and so on debasing the very function of the human mechanism, people were not functionally able or adequately able to receive spiritual things. So that's why it was so important for her and the early Adventists to push for, first of all, health reform, but more specifically, the temperance message. But there's just no evidence from the life of Christ, and then in particular in our group with Ellen White and the early Adventists, there's no evidence that we are called to bind up every wound, solve every social ill, and so on. It's worth remembering that Ellen White said of the Civil War, she said that God's punishment rested upon the South for its embrace of slavery. And yet that was the exact same moment that she and the other pioneers took the decision not to become involved in the Civil War. If there was ever a just war, that was it. But no, it was hands off. They were relatively hands off on it. There's only two issues that really stirred Ellen White and the early pioneers. It was the temperance message and the freeing of the slaves. And again, slavery is such an insult to the image of God. And as John Brown said, and I quote him quite often, remember John Brown, his body still lies a mouldering in the grave, as the song said. But he was sort of the catalyst of the Civil War, at least of the violent part of it. He was a radical abolitionist. And as they hung him, he said, the sins of this guilty country can only be washed away by blood. And it's worth remembering that while there's a certain American exceptionalism, justifiably so, it's been a shelter place for many persecuted people, there's a lot of guilt to go around. And not till we get on the other shore and the other world can we say that it's God's final kingdom. This is a halfway house. It's got high ideals. We've been privileged to live, be born here in many cases. I wasn't born here. Privileged to live and work here, and Adventism was on fertile soil as it began, but it's rapidly turning into a case study in forgotten norms and an embrace of old systems and old ways and old persecutions. And just as a little add-on to that, remember, if you didn't know it, even in this country, there was an extermination policy against the Mormons. Remember, in this country, there have been extermination policies against Indian tribes who desperately tried to make it up to Canada. Remember that we imprisoned Japanese Americans. Remember that we had exclusion acts right up until the 40s, as I remember, that forbade Chinese immigration as basically subhumans. And remember, right now, we're toying with excluding people that are not acceptable in this country, and yet, at the same time, still carrying this, the golden, not the golden, the Golden Gate has the sign, and the Lady Liberty, send me your tired and your poor. We need to make sure that our cliches match the reality, and in a little way, with the religious liberty, the civil liberty imperative, we can keep that alive a little longer. Thanks very much, and happy supper.
Thank you, Elder Steed. We have been very blessed. Thank you very much for coming and sharing for these many hours here. We appreciate it greatly. Let us have a word of prayer, and we will dismiss for supper. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the reminders of the importance of religious liberty. We pray that each one of us, Lord, would be in tune with what our duty is. In response to this, we pray that indeed we would be able to be lights in a world that very, very much needs it. We thank you for these things, and we pray them in your name. Amen.